2. Introduction. You have studied in the previous module, Module 3, that classical conditioning explains how new emotional and glandular reactions build up in response R to the stimuli S one receives from the environment. This type of conditioning is called SR conditioning, where an organism gives a response R to the environmental stimuli S. What classical conditioning does not explain is how we develop new skills or behaviors and how our behavior is in itself instrumental. This type of learning is commonly referred to instrumental or operant conditioning. Operant conditioning elaborates on how we develop behaviors that operate upon the environment to bring about behavioral consequences in that environment. To understand operant conditioning better, it will be useful to get acquainted with work done by some of the pioneers in the field. In this module, we will begin with E. L. Thorndike's 1898 work and understand the law of effect. Thorndike's work was extended and further refined by B. F. Skinner, 1938, which will be discussed in the section on Skinner's analysis. The module will also help in distinguishing between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Let us first begin with Thorndike's work. 3. Thorndike law of effect. American psychologist Edward Lee Thorndike had a keen interest in studying animal learning. He wanted to know how, in order to solve problems, animals learn to engage in new behaviors. These behaviors later become instrumental in nature. In order to understand this, Thorndike designed numerous ingenious experiments, such as making an animal escape from a confined space. In a series of classic experiments that Thorndike performed with cats and puzzle boxes, helped him in discovering the law of effect. Here's what he did. In one of these investigations to study the problem-solving behavior of cats using trial and error procedures, he devised a special apparatus or puzzle box and placed the cats in it. Thorndike developed a number of other forms of such puzzle boxes as well. However, a typical puzzle box consisted of a cage made of wood, which was equipped with a door. This door was held by a weighted loop of string holding, and a bar, and a pedal. Thorndike placed a hungry cat in this special apparatus, from which the animal was supposed to learn to escape. The cat produced many behaviors in its effort to escape the wooden cage confinement. The cat held in this confined space pressed the pedal, pulled the string, and eventually pushed the bar to unlatch the door to the box. This allowed the cat to escape from the box. This correct behavior had a consequences. Thorndike left a plate of food immediately outside the box that the cat would eat once it would come out of the box. In the beginning, the cat would almost behave randomly. In a bid to escape that cage confinement, the cat clawed or bit different parts of the cage randomly, using trial and error to find the way out of the puzzle box. Eventually, the animal would produce the correct behavior or response initially by chance. Thorndike tried to investigate what would happen to the cat's behavior over time. In particular, he wanted to know, would the cat get it right every time, once it would figure out the solution as to how to escape this puzzle box. To understand it, Thorndike took note of the time taken the animal to escape from the puzzle box each time and plotted a graph of the same. He found that over repeated trials, for each of the successive trials, the time taken to escape declined gradually. Simply, the time taken at each successive trial became less and less. Thorndike argued that since when the cat made a correct response, it was rewarded with escape and food, this reward raised the probability of correct response by the cat. In order to solve the problem, the cat used trial and error learning rather than resorting to simple reflexive responses. This made Thorndike believe that over time, positive consequences, stamped in, the correct response, and negative consequences, stamped out, all the possible incorrect responses. This made Thorndike propose his law of effect, which states that if successful behavior in a trial and error situation are followed by pleasurable consequences, those behaviors become strengthened, and will thus be more quickly performed in future trials. Thorndike, 1898. This law of effect laid one of the most important principles of operant conditioning. If a response, in the presence of a stimulus, is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the bond between the stimulus and response will be strengthened. It simply means that if in response to something we do, we get a reward, we are more likely to repeat the behavior in response to that stimulus in the future. Early forms of behaviorism are referred to as SR psychology by psychologists. Here, most of our behaviors are considered an accumulation of associations between stimulus S and response R. Thorndike's work is significant as he was one of the first to find out the effects of behavioral consequences on learning. The work done by Thorndike propelled him to give emphasis to the effects of both positive and negative behavioral consequences. Indeed, Thorndike proposed that all learning, including human learning, occurs by trial and error. Thus his work laid foundation for subsequent research in behavior and learning process. Since the cat's responses were instrumental in getting it out of the box, Thorndike called this instrumental conditioning. Later Skinner worked upon similar lines and termed the same kind of learning as operant conditioning. The next section elaborates Skinner's analysis in depth. 4. Skinner's analysis. Inspired by the works of Pavlov and Thorndike, B. F. Skinner, another American psychologist, went on to develop the principles of operant conditioning. In the above section, it was stated that Skinner based his work on the findings proposed by Thorndike. However, it is important to note that there was not a perfect fit between the work done by the two. Thorndike believed that learning occurs by trial and error, and law of effect further propels an organism towards new behavioral learning. Skinner eventually showed dissatisfaction with trial and error proposed by Thorndike. He argued what would happen if the animal never emits the correct response in a trial and error situation. What if the organism only made errors? In such a case, nothing can be. Psychology Paper 1. Cognitive Science. Reinforced and thus no learning, which is seen as a relatively permanent change in behavior, is likely to take place. According to Skinner, 1938, in operant conditioning, behavior develops and changes because of its consequences. He, however, revised Thorndike's concept of rewards by reinforcement and punishment. He emphasized that probability of a certain behavior increases due to the presentation of a stimulus as a behavioral consequence, positive reinforcement, or the removal of a stimulus, negative reinforcement, and in the case of punishment, probability of a certain behavior decreases due to the presentation of a stimulus as a behavioral consequence. Skinner further demonstrated that if consequences can be manipulated in a definite and systematic manner, an organism could be led to the correct behavior in a much shorter span of time than if one simply waited for the animal to accidentally stumble upon the correct response in the first place. He described this alternate process as one of shaping a target response or behavior through reinforcement of successive approximations to the target behavior. In addition to that, he also found out that reinforcing events do not have to happen all the time. Instead of giving reinforcement each and every time, intermittent reinforcement can also be given and it proves to be effective. In explaining these, he stressed the effect of different schedules of reinforcement on behavior. These concepts will be discussed at length in the next module. But before that is done, let us shed more light on Skinner's work. One of the most significant innovations made by Skinner's 1956 was a simple device for studying the effects of reinforcers on laboratory animals. It contained a box with a grid floor, a light, a lever which an animal could press in order to obtain food, and a food cup, which he called an operant chamber. This operant chamber that was used to demonstrate operant conditioning came to be popularly called as a Skinner box. This box was a direct descendant of the puzzle box used by Thorndike. Only modification being that the reinforcer could be systematically manipulated. In the experiment, the experimenter introduces a hungry rat into the Skinner box. He electronically recorded the animal's responses and activity, as the animal was put on a deprivation schedule and food is used as a reinforcer. The Skinner box is arranged so that when the hungry animal explores the enclosure, it eventually depresses the lever, the feeder mechanism is activated and a small pellet of food is released into the food cup. Soon the rat will associate the lever pressing with the appearance of the food and the rate of lever pressing will increase. Here, the rats must engage in lever pressing in order to get food. Thus the rat's behavior is instrumental in getting at the food reinforcement. As per the operant conditioning principles, the lever press response conditioned behavior, having been reinforced, will tend to be repeated, and when it is again reinforced, the probability of the occurrence of the behavior of lever pressing will be further repeated, and so on. Thus Skinner concluded that in order to avoid certain stimuli and to gain other stimuli, organisms operate on the environment. Simply put, reinforcement received by the environment increases the likelihood of a behavior to be repeated and punishment decreases the likelihood of a behavior to be repeated. Now let us compare operant and classical conditioning. 5. Distinguish between operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Psychology Paper 1. Cognitive Science. The principles on which operant conditioning is based and the techniques used in it will be discussed in depth in the next module. For now, let us try to understand the differences and similarities between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning differ firstly in the types of behaviors they work on. Secondly, there is also difference in the procedures of conditioning that they use. In classical conditioning, organisms learn to associate two stimuli, unconditioned stimuli UCS and conditioned stimuli CS. It is a form of respondent behavior that occurs in automatic response to a stimulus. Classical conditioning demonstrates how neutral stimuli come to be associated with unlearned, involuntary responses. Involuntary behaviors such as reflex actions and behaviors that are emotional can be explained better with classical conditioning. You must have noted that in classical conditioning, the organism has no control over reinforcement. It occurs when the experimenter wants it to occur. In other words, in classical conditioning, reinforcement is not contingent in any overt response made by the organism. However, to understand how behavior and reinforcement or punishment is related, we must concentrate our focus on another kind of conditioning called operant conditioning. The relationship between reinforcement and organism's behavior is distinctively different in operant conditioning. With operant conditioning, to get reinforcement, the organism must act in a certain way. This point has been shared earlier in the module, that reinforcement is contingent in the organism's behavior. Thus in instrumental conditioning, an animal's behavior is instrumental in getting it something it wants, that is, a reinforcer. Here, it is important to mention that Skinner's operant conditioning was founded on what Thorndike's called instrumental conditioning, and two are often used interchangeably to understand how organisms operate on the environment. There are differences in the way stimulus and response is sequenced in classical conditioning and operant conditioning. You may be reminded that in classical conditioning, the food comes prior to the response and hence it cannot serve as a reward. Operant conditioning is not initially correlated with known stimuli, it seems to appear almost spontaneously or perhaps accidentally. This is not to say that Skinner proposed that operant behavior occurs independently of stimuli. Unlike respondent behavior, which is dependent on the stimulus that precedes it, operant behavior is controlled by its consequences. In operant conditioning, the emphasis is on behavior and its consequences. The organism must respond in a particular way so as to produce the reinforcing stimulus. This process also exemplifies contingent reinforcement, because getting the reinforcer is contingent dependent upon the organism's emitting a certain response. Thus, operant conditioning requires a response that is followed by reinforcement, whereas classical conditioning ends with a response. The table below summarizes some of the key differences between classical and operant conditioning. Table 1. A comparison of classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, operant conditioning. Nature of target behavior. Involuntary, automatic, voluntary, under animals. Control order elicits a response from the animal. Animal response leads to reinforcement or punishment. Conditioning procedures. Neutral stimuli become associated with unconditioned stimuli. Consequences of behaviors influence subsequent. Psychology. Behaviors. Reinforcement. UCS. Reinforcement leads to response. Reinforcement is present regardless of whether a response occurs. Response of interest leads to reinforcement. Reinforcement is contingent on behavior. Key researchers: Ivan Pavlov, J.B. Watson, E.L. Thorndike, B.F. Skinner. Unlike classical conditioning, which pays attention on processes of learning and reflexive responses, operant conditioning sheds light on how organisms learn totally new behaviors through experience with consequences in the environment. With classical conditioning, a dog can be taught to salivate, but it is not possible to teach it to sit up or roll over. This is because salivation is a passive involuntary reflex, while to sit up and roll over are much more complex responses. These are voluntary responses. For a behavioral psychologist, however, it is possible to control such voluntary responses at behaviors by systematically manipulating the rewards and punishments associated with them. Remember that in classical conditioning there was no place for such rewards and punishments. In operant conditioning, however, the consequences of behavior such as rewards and punishments influence the chances whether that behavior will occur in the future or not. Rewards given in operant conditioning are effective in encouraging new behaviors, while in classical conditioning, eliciting same response to new stimuli is emphasized. Thus, theory of operant conditioning accounts for a much wider spectrum of behaviors than classical conditioning, and secondly, it is helpful in explaining new behaviors as well, and is not restricted to merely reflexive ones. Despite basic differences between classical and operant conditioning, they have many similarities. They have a number of terms such as stimulus, response, generalization, discrimination, extinction, and phenomena of spontaneous recovery in common. It points to the fact that it is impossible to separate classical and operant conditioning completely. 6. Summary. Thorndike investigated problem-solving behavior of cats using trial and error procedures, and proposed the law of effect. Law of effect laid that if a response, in the presence of a stimulus, is followed by a satisfying state of affairs, the bond between the stimulus and response will be strengthened. Skinner emphasized that probability of a certain behavior increases due to the presentation of a stimulus as a behavioral consequence, positive reinforcement, or the removal of a stimulus, negative reinforcement, and in the case of punishment, probability. Psychology Paper 1. Cognitive Science. Of a certain behavior decreases due to the presentation of a stimulus as a behavioral consequence. Classical and operant conditioning differ first in the types of behaviors they work on. Secondly, there is difference in the procedures of conditioning that they use. In classical conditioning, an organism gives a response R to the environmental stimuli S. In classical conditioning, an organism learns to associate two stimuli, unconditioned stimuli UCS and conditioned stimuli CS. In operant conditioning, the organism must act in a certain way before it is reinforced. That is, reinforcement is contingent in the organism's behavior. It is a form of behavioral learning where the probability of a response is changed by its consequences, that is, by the stimuli that follows the response. Classical conditioning focused on how involuntary behaviors like reflex actions and emotional behaviors are acquired. Operant conditioning pays attention on how organisms learn totally new behaviors through experience with consequences in the environment. Classical and operant conditioning have some terms such as stimulus, response, generalization, discrimination, extinction, and phenomena of spontaneous recovery in common.